Hello and welcome back to Mystery of Israel Radio. Archives of this broadcast can be found at zionchristianpress.org/radio. Last week we looked at Daniel chapter 12 as kind of an introduction to something that Jesus told us to look for concerning his return, concerning the trigger of the Great Tribulation, the time of Jacob's trouble, the time of distress such as not happened from the beginning of nations until then, Daniel chapter 12:2, quoting that. So we saw in Daniel chapter 12, which is only 13 verses long, we saw a reference to that abomination of desolation that Jesus told us to look for in the prophet Daniel in verse 11. From the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. We saw a little bit earlier in the chapter, verse 7, I heard the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and sware by him that lives forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time. And when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. To scatter the power of the holy people. 1,290 days. Time, times, and half a time. So these are just an introduction to things. And at the beginning of chapter 12, we made a note that it starts out saying, And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people, Daniel. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. So we just made the comment that we were going to come back to this when it says, and at that time, what does it mean? At what time? And so this chapter 12 is coming directly from the previous chapter. In fact, Daniel chapter 10, 11, and 12 is one incident. He starts off saying, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia. In verse 2, in those days I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks. And in the 4th and 20th day of the 1st month, I was by the side of the great river, which is Hiddekel. Then I lift up my eyes and looked, and behold, a certain man clothed in linen. The rest of Daniel chapter 10, 11, and 12 is the encounter with this certain man, and what he's told immediately after the encounter. So all of this deserves to be looked at in great detail. It deserves to be meditated on. But I want to go back to Daniel chapter 12 and the verses right before that, where it says, He shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. In verse 12, and at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which stands for your people. So who is this he that shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain? Yet he shall come to his end. So if we look back, almost every verse has a he. He shall go forth with great fury to destroy. Verse 44. Verse 43, he shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Verse 42, he shall stretch forth his hand upon the countries. 41, he shall enter into the glorious land. Verse 40, he shall pass into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. Verse 39, he shall do in the most strongholds with the strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. Verse 38, in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, or fortresses. Verse 37, neither shall he regard the God of his fathers. Verse 36, and the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself. Verse 30, the ships of Kittim shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. It goes all the way back. Verse 28, he shall do exploits and return to his own land. Verse 25, he shall stir up his power. 24, he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey and spoil. He shall forecast his devices. Verse 23, and after the covenant made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. Verse 22, and with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. Verse 21, and in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. So it goes, that he that ended in verse 45 goes all the way back to verse 21. And you might read some commentaries that try to suggest otherwise, but you can't find a break between verse 21 and verse 45. This he is going all the way through. And we kind of skipped over a verse, and and it's significant because it also mentions the abomination that causes desolation that we read about in chapter 12:11. So this was in verse 31. I'm going to back up to verse 30 again, where it said, the ships of Kittim shall come against him, therefore he shall be grieved, and return, and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake thy holy covenant, and arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that makes desolate. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. So, is there any reason to believe that this abomination that makes desolate in verse 31, chapter 11, 31, is there any reason to believe that this is different than the abomination that makes desolate in Daniel chapter 11? No, because chapter 11 flows right into chapter 12. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which stands for the children of thy people. Verse 2, and many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. That is the resurrection of the dead, as we mentioned last week. So this narration from chapter 11:21 on through the end of the book is a narration of the events that take place right before the return of the Lord, the resurrection of the dead, the return of Israel, the rapture of the church. So in future weeks, we're going to work our way back into some of the earlier visions from the book of Daniel. Chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 8. And we've already spent some time in chapter 9, but if you'll remember, we kind of stopped at the very last verse we talked about the 7 sevens and the 62 sevens that make up part of the 77s that were determined for Daniel's people and for his holy city. But we didn't talk a lot about the last 7 because it's a very difficult verse if you take it just by itself. Daniel 9:27 says, "And he," who is this he? And what I'm suggesting is that he is the same he as what we were just reading about in Daniel chapter 11. Because the previous verse says, "The people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined." And then the verse 27, "And he shall confirm the covenant." We talk about the covenant made with him, or the league made with him, in chapter 11. "He shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 7, or 1 week. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation," the return of the Lord, the rapture of the church, the resurrection of the dead, the return of Israel. "And that determined shall be poured upon the desolate." So we're going to go through these other visions. We're going to spend a little bit more time in Daniel chapter 10 through 12. So we want to read this in such a way that it can apply to our generation, even if our generation is not the final generation. But I'm reading it as if our generation is the final generation. I'm reading it as if the final 7 is also the end of the 2,000 years. The 2 days, after 2 days he will revive us. On the 3rd day he'll raise us up and we shall live in his sight. So open up your Bibles. Let's begin to work our way through this book. We're going to see how it lines up with the other prophets. It's going to take a while, 14 minutes at a time. But it's not too hard. You can understand this. In fact, God is rooting for you to understand this. One of the phrases that we're going to see over and over again with Daniel is know and understand. So join us next time as we open the book and meditate on his word. These things were written for those upon whom the end of the age has come. I'm Tom Quinlan, and this is Mystery of Israel Radio.